Okay, I'm back with the same data set. I've taken it from Excel and I've moved it into SPSS. And I actually did this over the remote lab system. It took me a little while. You'll see that the remote lab system can be a little sticky, a little difficult to do. But I started here in the variable view, and I went ahead and I looked at these variables that I had in my teacher stress survey. So these, if you remember, these variables that went from never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always, I've given 1 through 5 to those. And then I've given them short names like change, workload. Let's see what I gave to them. Change, workload, scores, budgets, relationships, expectations. This is student conflict and this is parental conflict. I included the other, although we'll talk in a minute about what you might do with this other. Now these two, time and coping, came from my choose all that apply question. If you remember, we took that question, I went through and I gave each of the potential responses a number. So there might be a 1 and a 3 given by this respondent, or this respondent said 2, 1, and 3. This respondent responded with 5 and 6, 8. And if you remember, I've taken great notes. I've got my code book here. And so I know that 1 has to do with time pressures and workload, and 2 has to do with this coping with change. And I didn't finish all the rest of it. You'll need to continue to work through this and do this work. But once I had these in Excel, then I would copy the column. So I copied time pressures and workload, and I inserted it right here, time pressures and workload, into my data view. So if you look right here, these zeros and these ones, they're just copied from Excel. One thing that I might do in the variable view is under values. Well, let's see, not here necessarily. Well, I would want to do it there too. Here under values, I would want to put never for 1, sometimes for 2, so on and so forth. Here in time for values, I would put a 0, means no, it's not a problem. Add that to my column, and 1, yes, this is a problem, and add that to this column. Okay, so now I've got this no and yes for time. And I could actually just copy this and paste it in here. Now, I like this scale from 1 to 5, never to always, because even a strange number like 4.17823, it gives you a sense of that's a little bit more than often. You know, 4.1 is a little bit higher than often, starting to move toward always, whereas a 1.8, it's not never, it's moving towards sometimes, but or it's moving toward rarely, excuse me, I think rarely was the next level. So, you know, it's less than rarely, but it's more than never. So it's happened once maybe, right? So let's go in and calculate some means for these, okay? So what I can do here in my analyze is under compare means, I am going to choose the means option. And what I want is, and I should reset this, I want SPSS to give me the means for the people who chose time as a problem, right? And the means for people who chose coping as a stressor. And so I'm putting those in as my independent variables. Go back and review chapter 2. The independent variables are the ones that come with the study that might influence the dependent variables. Well, these are my dependent variables, and I'm going to highlight all of them. In the remote lab, I have to do it one at a time. Excuse me, and put them in the dependent list. Okay, let's see what we get. Once you click on a button in Excel or in SPSS, this second window will open. If you remember, there's a little quiz on this in Chapter 3. So this is my case processing summary, not too interesting. But here are my means. Okay, for those who said no, that no, let's see, and this would be on the first question, right? Let's see, this is, I would want to go through and explain this a little bit more because it has everything up here in the title. But this would be no on the, let me just double check myself here. No on this time idea. So no, time was not a stressor for them. Well, let's see then what their means were. Change is 2.6, so that's almost sometimes, between rarely and sometimes, not too big a deal. Workload is 3.3. So for those who said time wasn't a problem, they still felt like workload was sometimes to even often a problem. Scores weren't quite as high. Budgets were really high. So those who didn't have time problems, they were almost often with budget problems, going from sometimes to often here at 3.8. You can kind of look at those means and say, well, which is the highest? What's the biggest problem for people who don't have a time constraint? It looks like it might be budgets. That's got the highest mean. Perhaps expectations of themselves as teachers. Look, those who don't have time problems are really low, quite low on parent conflict here and student conflict here. So interesting. But look at this other. There's some other that is more than sometimes. It's between sometimes and often. That's a problem for these people who are not stressed about time. So what do we do about that? Well, fortunately, this survey has an open-ended question. And what you would want to do is, after you've reported these means and talked about how budgets is really high, expectations is really high, other is quite high, get into your open-ended comments and quote a little bit. One respondent said, and I quote, "My problem is I don't like to be the recess monitor when it's 10 degrees outside." And then you can use that to support this other. Or perhaps you have an interesting score that you weren't expecting. So let's look down here in our coping variable. Oh, here it is right here. It says coping right here. Okay. These tables are very busy. If you were to adopt them into APA style, you would need to shorten the title and take out some, probably I would take out the N here, for example. Whether it's 18 or 19, it's still a great sample. You need the standard deviation. Okay, look at this coping right here. For those who said coping is a problem, yes. Look at the mean, 5. That means it's change is always a problem for those who struggle with coping. Wow, workload is always a problem. 5, scores are always a problem. Okay, that's because there was one person. This poor person seems a little stressed out. Okay, budgets, sometimes, right? Let's look at something. Well, we're going to have to look at the no's. Since on coping, it seems like we just had one person who really struggles with the coping. For those who don't struggle with the coping, let's see what they said. They have budgets quite high again. And look, expectations are quite high again. My guess is when this survey, when our student completes analyzing the survey, you'll see that expectations and budgets are just a commonality among people, whether they struggle with time or coping or any of those things. And then as you begin to experience some of this, as you go through and analyzing these from different points of view, you might find some things in the open-ended questions to support that. You might be able to quote, one respondent said, "It looks like budgets are going to be slashed, which means my class size will be doubled, and I don't think I can do that. I'm looking for a job somewhere else. Or you might quote someone who says, I had such high expectations when I started teaching, and I wasn't able to reach little Johnny back in the corner, and that's why I feel like I need to quit. You can look at those responses, but just use those to give a personal flavor to what your numbers say. By adding some of those open-ended comments, are you changing this to a qualitative paper? No, you're supporting the quantitative study that you've done. Surveys are almost always quantitative, which is great because then you have these hard numbers. You can just say flat out, expectations is a high mean. Student conflict, parental conflict, those just aren't as high. They're not as big a deal as we thought they might be. But wow, expectations might be a little bit of a surprise. Maybe we here at UW need to do more to help our students be more gentle on themselves and perhaps even lower their expectations a little. I don't know. This will come out in the conclusion, and I'm really looking forward to reading this paper. But I wanted to give you a sense of how these choose all apply questions can actually come in to helping us break down the means. You know, this here, how many said no to time being a stressor, how many said yes to time being a stressor, and how did their means differ? So for example, those who said yes to time being a stressor, their workload mean is a lot higher than those who said no. It's 4.4. So they're stressed about their workload. They're stressed about scores. They're less stressed, believe it or not, about budgets, and just slightly less stressed. We might even find that those two means are basically the same, 3.8, 3.7. But still, it's less of a stress. They're more stressed about relationships, pretty much the same on their expectations. I think expectations is going to be an interesting variable here. Pretty much the same with student conflict, parental conflict, other. So you might be able to tease out some of the differences in means because now you can form groups around this choose all that apply questions. So that's just one way to do this. There are hundreds of ways. I'm hoping to give you enough ideas without overly saturating you with videos so that you can have fun with your data. Just try something. Anything that you want to try is okay with me. The hardest thing is you'll need to explain it. Okay, see that number down there, that 7? That means that 7 said yes. We're good. Have fun with it. Please write with questions. I love to hear from you. And thanks for listening.